Hello guys, welcome to how Aristotle refutes Parmenides and Zeno and Heraclitus. And so, Parmenides is a philosopher who argued that only what is or what exists truly exists, and while what is not, like what doesn't exist, is impossible for it to even exist. This led him to conclude that reality must be one, eternal and unchanging, so he is a monist. And change and multiplicity are illusions, and multiplicity just means like several things, but they're not distinct, right? Like there is no distinction, all reality is one. And so, however, Aristotle points out that Parmenides was forced to reformulate his theory with sensory experience, so he ended up introducing a secondary dualism, which divided reality into hot, which is fire, and cold, into earth. He equated the hot with existence and the cold with non-existence. And so Parmenides was a monist who believed that all reality was one, and his argument is as follows. Premise 1. Change would require being to arise from non-being, nothingness, or you could also say would require existence to arise from non-existence. 2. But from nothing, nothing comes. 3. Therefore, change cannot occur. And Parmenides' student supported his central thesis that change was an illusion through paradoxes. In the dichotomy paradox, Zeno argued that to move from point A to point B, one must first reach the midpoint. Before reaching the midpoint, one must reach another midpoint, and so on infinitely. Thus, movement, change of location, would require an infinite number of steps in a finite amount of time, which is impossible, so movement cannot occur. And so Aristotle responds to Parmenides first by introducing the act and potency distinction. Instead of change being that being arising from non-being, he says that change is the actualization of potentiality, meaning a thing already has potential to change in certain ways. Change does not involve absolute non-being, but a transition from potency to actuality. For example, take a ball. Being an act, which is actuality, the ball is spherical, solid, red, smooth, and motionless. And being in potency, potentiality, the ball has the capacity or potential to be flat, squishy, rough, light pink, or rolling. And even though these potentials are not actual, they still exist as real possibilities within the ball itself. Aristotle introduces potency as a middle category between being an act, which is actualized existence, and non-being, which is absolute nothingness. Thus, change is not a transition from nothing to something, but rather from potency to actuality. This refutes the Eleatics because Parmenides and Zeno misunderstood change because they lacked the distinction between act and potency. And so once this distinction is made, then change is no longer contradictory because something potential is not nothing, right? It is something real, but not yet actual. And this also refutes Heraclitus because Heraclitus, on the opposite extreme, who claims that everything is in motion, he says that everything is changing constantly, and he says you can't step in the same river twice. That's a famous saying, by the way. And so Aristotle's act-potency distinction moderates this claim by showing that while change is real, there has to be something that's stable, which is actualities. And you could look at this in his theory of hylomorphism, right? And also, if Parmenides' position is true, then the claim that everything is at rest must follow. Now examine the claim. If everything were at rest, nothing would ever have changed, but people and things come into existence and change all the time. So this is obviously false. We can already invalidate this using our senses. And if all things were at rest, then the same statements would always be true and false, because there would be no change, right? However, statements do clearly change over time, proving that the world is not permanently at rest. And a speaker himself came into existence at some point in the past and will cease to exist in the future, and this is evidence that not all things are at rest. And on the contrary, let's examine Heraclitus' claim that everything is in motion. Motion requires something that is not moving, or else motion would not have a reference point. Some things, for example, eternal things do not change, like 1 plus 1 equals 2, the first mover. If all things were in motion, then no truth would ever be fixed, because reality would be in a constant state of flux. But if nothing remains stable, then nothing can be true, because truth depends on stable definitions. This would mean that all statements are false, which we have already proven to be impossible. And Aristotle also refutes monism through a reductio ad absurdum. Monism allows for the possibility of contradictions, and if contradictory statements about the same subject were both true at the same time, everything would collapse into one undifferentiated entity. For example, if it is true both that Socrates is a man and Socrates is not a man, then all distinctions collapse. A wall, a trireme, ancient Greek worship by the way, and a man would all just be the same thing, which would lead to the impossibility of identity, and ultimately it would destroy the possibility of knowledge, and therefore you can never ever engage in a rational debate or dialogue or even conversation. And so this is a reductio ad absurdum, right? And so and this would contradict the most fundamental principle, which is the law of non-contradiction, that nothing can both be that nothing can both be and not be at the same time in the same respect. And so one more refutation to Heraclitus. Reasoning requires a persisting subject that moves through logical steps, but if there is no stability, then the person concluding an argument is not the same person who started it. So ultimately, you do need the self in knowledge and arguments, right? If that is the case, then who's even making the argument? However, I will cover the multiplicity and unity debate in a later video where Parmenides and Zeno and Aristotle talk about the one. Alright, moving on to the dichotomy paradox. So, then again, to recap, it's just that from point A to point B, there's a midpoint, but that midpoint can be infinitely divided into many midpoints, and so the runner would have to travel infinitely many distances in a in a finite time, which is impossible. And so Aristotle responds to Zeno's paradoxes the same way he responds to Parmenides, which is using the act and potency distinction. The fundamental flaw in Zeno's reasoning is that he fails to distinguish between being an act, which is actuality, and being in potency, potentiality. His paradoxes assume that all distances between 2 points, such as A and B, are actually present in infinite quantity. However, Aristotle and later the scholastics, like Thomas Aquinas, and argued that these distances exist only potentially, not actually, right? Since there is no actually infinite number of distances that a runner must traverse, Zeno's arguments collapse. It's the same way you can take the example of a line. For example, it is true that you can potentially extend the line indefinitely, but it is not the case that it actually exists, right? It's not something that is actual. It's only something that's potential. So infinities in Aristotle's philosophy is only potential, not actual.